Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's virtual information session and open house for the Boyle Heights Community Plan Update. Next slide. Today we'll give a presentation with an overview of the community plan, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A session. We're going to begin our public hearing at 5 p.m. today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have additional questions or you're unable to use the Q&A function, you can always email questions to our team at boyleheightsplan@lacity.org, and they'll be answered after tonight's meeting. Next slide. To access audio, please select your preferred language. For the best audio quality, all attendees should select a language shown under the interpretation button. If you're calling in by phone, you will not be able to hear the interpretation into Spanish. La presentación y la audiencia pública será traducido a español. Por favor, usa el botón de interpretación para seleccionar español. Si está llamando por teléfono, no podría escuchar en español. Si necesitas traducción a español, por favor, reúnase por la aplicación de Zoom. Next slide. Please note that all attendee webcams and microphones are automatically disabled. If you need technical support throughout this event, please use the chat function. If you would like to ask a question to be answered during the Q&A portion of this event, please use the Q&A box shown here. Next slide. We'll begin the presentation shortly. Thank you. All right, I see the time is 4:06. Let's go ahead and start today's presentation. Next slide. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's information session and public hearing for the Boyle Heights Community Plan Update. This community plan is an effort by Los Angeles City Planning in partnership with the local community that began nearly 10 years ago. We want to take a moment to thank all of the community members, community organizations, and community leaders who have provided their expertise to help us shape and develop the goals, policies, and unique strategies of the proposed Boyle Heights Community Plan. We would not be at this point without your input and support, and we hope that as you review the many proposals within this plan, that you see a reflection of your values, your ideas, and your concerns. If this is your first time engaging with the Boyle Heights Community Plan, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to take a moment to address some of the events of the past 2 weeks that have disrupted communities across our city, particularly related to the recent audio recordings that were released involving 3 members of the LA City Council. The racism, the colorism, the homophobia, and the hateful rhetoric that we heard are absolutely unacceptable and inexcusable, and we want to be clear that we strongly condemn the horrific things that were said, as well as the blatant disregard that was shown for a transparent and democratic redistricting process. Members of this community have spent nearly a decade developing this plan alongside city planning staff, and collectively we've worked hard over the years to establish a transparent process that's accessible to everyone. We are grateful for all of the community leaders and residents who have worked with us over the years, and we hope that you can continue to move this plan forward as a collective vision of the people and by the people. I also want to be clear that this plan is a program of the City Planning Department, and it is not a product of the current representative of CD14, nor the previous one. We understand that there's a great deal of concern about future representation within Council District 14, and we want to affirm that this is a city planning-led process. After tonight's public hearing, a recommendation will be brought forward to the City Planning Commission for initial consideration. After the City Planning Commission provides its recommendation, there are future meetings with the City Council's Land Use Committee and later the full City Council. In total, these next steps can take several months, if not longer. This plan is a result of years of community engagement and input, and we hope that today we can demonstrate how we've incorporated the feedback we've heard over the years to create this draft of the Boyle Heights Community Plan. And we look forward to hearing your recommendations about how to improve and refine the proposed plan. Next slide. Today, we'll walk through an overview of community planning, as well as past progress of the Boyle Heights Community Plan, and we'll walk through how the plan is addressing key topics. As a note, this presentation is also being translated into Spanish on the Spanish interpretation channel. If you're listening in English, you may notice some pauses in between slides while we wait for the interpreter to finish interpreting what we've just presented. Next slide. To start tonight's presentation, we'll give a high-level overview of what community plans are and what their role is within the city. Next slide. Every city in California is required to have a general plan, which serves as a blueprint for the future. In the city of Los Angeles, decisions about land use are guided by the city's 35 community plan areas, which make up the land use element of the general plan. The community plans function as a guide for growth in an equitable and sustainable way, and they are periodically updated by the City of Los Angeles. There are currently several community plan updates underway, shown in dark blue on the map. The Boyle Heights Community Plan, which is the topic of today's meeting, is one of the community plans that is currently undergoing an update. Next slide. The community plan update process involves in-depth community engagement to establish a collective vision for the neighborhood that guides future growth and development. The community plan also acts as a tool to address community issues or opportunities, and the process includes developing and adopting a policy document that lays out the community vision and uses land use and zoning changes to implement that vision. Plans are also updated to accommodate the needs of current and future residents of the community, which includes identifying areas and planning for housing and job growth in a meaningful and equitable way. Next slide. At a high level, community plans address three major overarching issues that are pressing in our city and our region today: climate change, access to housing, and equity. Next slide. So why is this community plan being updated now? The current community plan for Boyle Heights was last updated in 1998. Since then, there have been growing needs for affordable housing, addressing environmental injustice issues, and new infrastructure investments in the community, most notably the construction of the L line. Current zoning and land use regulations, which shape the kinds of development projects seen in the community today, were last adopted in 1998. For example, the 1998 plan does not address ongoing issues of residential displacement, which we know is one of the most pressing issues in Boyle Heights today. The reason this plan update is so important is to include new regulations and updated policies that can help shape new development in a way that reflects the community's vision. Until this community plan is adopted, the current 1998 policies and regulations will continue to apply. This community plan update process started in 2012, and since then, city planning has been conducting outreach with the community to gather input and help shape the direction of this community plan. Next slide. After this plan update launched in 2012, throughout 2013 and 2014, the team held several topical focus groups to solicit input from community members and organization leaders to identify issues and opportunities that could be addressed throughout the community plan update process. Throughout the years, we've met and taken input from residents, community organizations, local students, business owners, property owners, tenants, developers, Chamber of Commerce, and the Neighborhood Council. We're extremely grateful for all of the community members and organizations who have participated in this update process for so many years, and we thank you for your continued engagement and continued feedback. Next slide. In 2015 and 2016, the team held workshops to share initial draft policy concepts with the community. In 2016, we held a public scoping meeting. In 2017 and 2018, we held additional workshops and open houses to share updated policy concepts, a draft community plan policy document, a land use map, and zoning concepts. Throughout 2018 and 2019, we held roundtable discussions with various neighborhood council committees to workshop the language in the plan text. We held a Community Planning 101 workshop in collaboration with community organizations and partnered with the Neighborhood Council to host 2 Planning 101 sessions in the community. Next slide. Throughout 2020, we worked to incorporate all of the feedback that we had heard during these years of outreach since our initial draft in 2017. In the fall of 2020, we released an updated draft plan, draft land use map, and we released the first comprehensive draft of the new zoning districts. We also held office hours to meet with residents and stakeholders and presented to the Neighborhood Council Land Use Committee and other community groups. In the spring of 2021, we released a 4-part video series in English and Spanish that provides a detailed overview of the community plan and proposed policies. In the fall of 2021 and spring of 2022, we conducted community workshops in collaboration with local community organizations. This summer, we published the draft environmental impact report, as well as updated versions of the plan text, zoning and land use maps, community plan implementation overlay, or CPIO, and the related informational materials. Today, we're here to hold our public hearing, which begins the first step of the adoption process for the community plan update. After tonight's public hearing, we'll bring the proposed plan to the City Planning Commission and then City Council. There will be public hearings held at those future meetings as well, and our team is always available for feedback and comments throughout the whole process. There's still a long process ahead of us, and no decision will be made at tonight's public hearing. Next slide. Over these years of outreach, we've heard many different perspectives, lived experiences, and needs from the community. Primarily, we've heard concerns and feedback about housing, particularly safeguarding existing households and maintaining the existing housing that's in Boyle Heights today. We've also heard the need for affordable housing and housing that's accessible to residents of Boyle Heights, and we've heard issues related to environmental injustice, the need for access to healthy foods, and creating safer streets and mobility options for everyone. Next slide. The plan builds upon the neighborhood's rich cultural identity and history of activism which defines Boyle Heights today. The policies and zoning tools presented here today respond to community feedback and set a course of action to achieve the desired goals for the Boyle Heights community through zoning and land use. Next slide. At a high level, the community plan aims to address the housing needs of both current and future residents of the neighborhood, maintain the rich cultural history and neighborhood identity of Boyle Heights, promote local jobs and space for small businesses to thrive, address longstanding issues of environmental injustice, and address the pressing issues of climate change and climate adaptation. Next slide. The community plan update consists of 3 primary components: the policy document or plan text, which contains the goals, policies, and programs that help to guide development and adaptation over the next 20 years. The goals and policies are important because once a community plan is adopted, our colleagues in the City Planning Department who review development projects will look at these policies to decide if they will approve or deny a project and identify any additional conditions or design features that should be incorporated into the project. In addition, the community plan text is a community vision put forward and is used by other agencies and departments to determine where future investment should go. The second piece is the general plan land use map, which generally says what types of uses can be built where, and generally at what scale and intensity those uses can be. The third piece is updates to the zoning and other implementing ordinances, such as the Community Plan Implementation Overlay, or CPIO, which create regulations and standards for every property within the neighborhood and create additional regulations outside of the zoning to implement specific needs for Boyle Heights. Next slide. Now that we've established a bit about what a community plan is, let's shift our focus to why we're here today, the Boyle Heights Community Plan Update. Next slide. Boyle Heights today has approximately 89,000 people, and the median household income is about $47,000 a year, which is about half of the countywide median income of $91,000 a year. The average household size is about 3 to 4 people, which is higher than the citywide average. Next slide. The Boyle Heights plan area is about 6 square miles and has about 24,000 dwelling units. Boyle Heights is a relatively young community with almost half of all households having one or more persons under 18 years old, and 75% of all households are occupied by renters, which make issues related to housing affordability and displacement especially important. Next slide. The majority of units, almost 90%, in Boyle Heights were built before 1978, with about 71% of all multi-unit properties in Boyle Heights being built before 1978. The city's Rent Stabilization Ordinance, or RSO, applies to multi-unit properties built before 1978, which makes a high percentage of the existing housing stock in Boyle Heights subject to the RSO. Next slide. Let's dive into land use. So land use is a broad category of how land is to be used in the future. Each property is given a land use designation, and everything on the land use map is binding. The existing and proposed land use maps here show land use designations throughout Boyle Heights, which are shown in different colors. These designations essentially convey what goes where in terms of future land uses and regulations. Today, the land uses in Boyle Heights are predominantly multi-unit residential, which are shown in shades of tan and orange, with commercial and mixed-use corridors that go north-south and east-west throughout the plan area, shown in the pinks and the reds. The plan area is bordered on the west and the south by industrial land, which is shown in the blue. The community plan update proposes similar land uses with primarily multi-unit residential uses throughout all of the existing residential neighborhoods, mixed-use commercial corridors, and proposes to maintain the industrial land for jobs. I want to highlight today a few of the changes that are proposed to land use as part of the community plan update. While some of these land use designations may result in changes to what can be built on a property, it's important to remember that this community plan does not include construction or development for any particular sites. Instead, it updates the regulations and the requirements for future development in the plan area and regulates what can be built where. Next slide. In certain industrial areas, the proposal is to change land uses from heavy industrial to light industrial. So this would continue to allow for light manufacturing uses, but would prevent new, heavier industrial uses in this area. And we'll cover this a little bit more later. Next slide. Along Soto Street, which primarily allows only residential uses under the current zoning, the plan would allow mixed-use development, or both commercial and residential, or a combination of the two, to be built along Soto Street from the 10 freeway to 4th Street. Next slide. Additional changes include some increases to the number of housing units that can be built in some of the blocks near the L line stations, including Pico Aliso, Soto, and Indiana stations. Next slide. Under the 1998 plan and the current regulations, Cesar Chavez Boulevard and the Sears site today both have a land use designation of regional center, which are the only regional center land use designations in the Boyle Heights community plan area. This designation means that it's identified as an area where the most growth and highest intensity of development should go. Under the proposed plan, Cesar Chavez will be changed to something called neighborhood center, which reduces the intensity of development that could occur, and additional zoning regulations would be applied, which we'll cover later in the presentation. Next slide. Let's take a closer look at the Sears site. The plan proposes to change this site to a land use designation of community center, which would continue to allow the same uses as the land use and zoning do today, including both commercial and residential uses or a combination of the two. But it would no longer identify the site as an area where the greatest intensity of development should go. The map on the left shows the existing land use designations for the site. The area in red is designated as regional center, and the blue area is designated as light manufacturing. The map on the right shows that the land use designation is proposed to change to community center as part of the Boyle Heights Community Plan update, which is shown in pink. This is a change to the land use designation, so that means that there isn't a change to the Sears building itself or to the generally permitted uses. Similar to the current regional center land use designation, the proposed community center designation would also allow a range of uses, including residential and commercial uses, or a combination of the two. There have been some recent media reports and community meetings about the property owner's initial conceptual plans for a shelter and social services on this site. It's important to be very clear that the property owner has not submitted permits or any other plans for review to the city for this project at this time. Changing the land use or zoning through this community plan update would not automatically clear the path for the property owner to develop the site without permits or other necessary approvals. Any future development projects on this site would have to go through a separate permitting and approval process that is completely independent from the process to update the Boyle Heights Community Plan. Next slide. The land use designations that I just covered are generally broad categories that state at a high level what kinds of uses are allowed, and the zoning that's applied to each property contains the more specific regulations of what can be built. The Boyle Heights Community Plan update will be the second community plan in the city to use the new zoning code that's being developed for the city. This means that each property in the community plan will be assigned a new zone, but only in some cases will it change what intensity or uses can be built on that site. Part of today's presentation will review some new zoning tools that we've been able to incorporate in response to community feedback in Boyle Heights that we don't have the tools to do under the current zoning code. To provide a brief overview of the pieces of the new zoning, here's an example of the 5 zoning modules or districts that will be assigned to each property. Form districts regulate building size. Frontages regulate how the building looks from the street. Standards contain regulations like parking and landscaping. Use districts list what specific uses are permitted or are not, or require a process. And density districts regulate how many units can be built on a property if residential uses are allowed. Next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Ernesto to take us through what the Boyle Heights Community Plan update is proposing to address a few of the topics that we've heard throughout the years of outreach. As a reminder, if you have questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the chat function to send us a message and we'll try to resolve the issue. Ernesto, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Karen. The previous sections of this presentation have reviewed what a community plan is and how zoning and land use work to implement the community's vision. The community plan process takes stakeholder input, creates the draft policy document that sets a policy vision for the community for the next 20 years, and uses zoning and land use changes to implement that vision. The plan update process does not build any infrastructure or development projects, but sets the regulations for future projects in the community. Next slide. In the following slides, we will examine how the proposed plan policies and zoning tools address some of the key overarching topics and issues that have been heard over the past several years of outreach. Primarily, we will talk about what the plan is doing to help maintain the neighborhood identity, address longstanding environmental injustices in the community, and a multi-leveled approach to address a range of housing issues that we've heard. Next slide. With its legacy of small businesses and built as one of Los Angeles's earliest residential suburbs, Boyle Heights is regarded as a community with deep roots and a rich history. Boyle Heights is unique in its history and character and plays an important role in the city of Los Angeles as a cultural resource. And the plan contains policies and zoning tools to maintain the rich cultural history and identity of the community. Next slide. Let's look at some of the examples of how new zoning proposals address the issues stakeholders have identified. Boyle Heights has a distinct characteristic of small legacy businesses throughout the community, particularly on corridors such as Cesar y Chavez, parts of First Street, and Wabash Avenue, shown here in the lighter blue turquoise color. To reflect this existing pattern of small businesses, the new zoning limits commercial establishment sizes to 5,000 square feet. Corridors such as Soto Street and Whittier Boulevard, shown in dark blue, will allow larger commercial spaces to accommodate uses like a grocery store. Currently, zoning regulations do not regulate maximum commercial sizes, so small business spaces can be combined into one larger commercial space under existing regulations. Limiting new tenant sizes requires new development to provide smaller and therefore more affordable commercial spaces for businesses. While the plan is not able to regulate or enforce who is allowed to open businesses through the proposed zoning, the plan text does contain a future implementation program to partner with other departments for small business and local entrepreneur assistance, and contains policies for future projects to protect existing legacy businesses. A key concern we've heard through our outreach as well is including stronger anti-displacement measures for commercial tenants, because the city does not currently have a program to prevent commercial displacement. As part of the economic analysis that we're currently undertaking is studying anti-displacement best practices for commercial businesses. Next slide. Another zoning tool the community plan is proposing is to accommodate tienditas in residential zones. Tienditas, or corner stores, are essential in providing the Boyle Heights community with food items and household goods within walking distance. Many tienditas currently exist in Boyle Heights today in areas zoned for residential uses only, meaning that they are currently non-conforming, and this also prevents new ones from opening in residential areas. New zoning regulations allow limited introduction of non-residential uses such as new corner stores in the residential neighborhoods, providing new opportunities for small business and providing more residents access to food and household goods. These uses are subject to the following limitations: a maximum of 1,500 square feet in size, limited hours of operation, and can only be located on a corner property. In addition, based on feedback received over the years, alcohol sales will no longer be allowed in new tienditas throughout the plan area. The plan also includes policies and programs that encourage these corner stores to provide fresh produce and groceries to the community, with future programs and partnerships identified to help incentivize sales of fresh produce in these stores. Next slide. In addition to zoning to allow for new commercial amenities in the residential neighborhoods, the plan uses zoning to ensure new development is reflective of the existing character in areas identified as potentially historic. One of the most notable historic landmarks in Boyle Heights is a historic commercial corridor of Cesar y Chavez Boulevard between Mott Street and Cummings Street, which is also designated as a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument known as a Brooklyn Avenue Neighborhood Corridor. The plan introduces new regulations through the zoning, specifically a special character frontage that will be applied to the stretch of Cesar Chavez, which requires new buildings to use some of the design elements found on buildings today in new development. The character frontage is a component of the zoning and does not require additional design review procedures. Next slide. A similar approach is being taken with certain residential pockets in the community that have been identified as potentially historic in the city's Survey LA, which is the city's historic resources survey. These areas will be zoned with a residential character frontage that would require architectural elements reflective of the community history. Next slide. The residential character frontage will be applied to the area shown in orange on this map, the area between the 101 and Interstate 5 freeways, as well as on certain streets near Hollenbeck Park. In addition to the character frontage, to make sure that new development reflects the existing historic architecture, the plan introduces a new process that forestalls demolition for identified eligible historic resources within this area shown in orange on the map. Next slide. Beyond new zoning regulations for potentially historic areas and small businesses, over the years of outreach, we have heard from community members the importance that street vending plays in both the identity of Boyle Heights as well as the local economy. Street vending is a key source of fresh and prepared foods in areas that are underserved by major grocery chains, and they are a means to activate the public realm as well as provide opportunities for entrepreneurship. The plan supports current street vending efforts at the state and local level and contains policies that encourage cleaning, preparation, and disposal facilities as part of future projects in the community. Next slide. Now that I've walked through what the plan is doing to maintain the existing neighborhood identity, let's walk through some measures we're taking to address existing environmental injustices. In Boyle Heights today, there are many examples of incompatible land uses, meaning that industrial land is next to residential or other sensitive uses. Coupled with freeways that cut through the neighborhood, Boyle Heights residents bear the burden of contamination from freeways, truck traffic, and industrial land. Residents and community groups have mobilized around issues of environmental injustice in the community for decades. In response to this, the plan uses a number of approaches to address issues of community health and environmental injustice. Next slide. The Cleanup Greenup Overlay, or CUGU, was adopted in 2016 and was a years-long community-driven effort to establish green zones, which means that it adopted new standards and regulations to protect sensitive or residential uses from nearby heavy and noxious use. This ordinance was adopted as an overlay, and as part of the Boyle Heights Community Plan update, the regulations from CUGU will be incorporated into the new zoning for the Boyle Heights Community Plan area, embedding them as part of the permanent zoning regulations for the community. Examples include enclosure and buffering standards, as well as distancing requirements for new uses. Another way the plan is incorporating cleanup greenup regulations into the community plan update is by limiting new auto-related uses from located near residential uses. With the new zoning, corridors such as Soto, Whittier, First, Fourth, and Cesar Chavez will no longer permit new auto-related uses, such as auto repair, auto body shops, and gas stations to open. These changes are in line with moving hazardous uses away from residential areas and improving compatibility between these uses in Boyle Heights, which you have heard as a priority over the years of this plan update. Next slide. Through the years, another big concern that has been raised are issues of soil contamination, in particular the decades of lead contamination from the Exide battery recycling plant. The plan includes new requirements to better address contaminated soils and minimize public health risk by requiring soil sampling for projects that include ground disturbance, which means projects have to complete a soil test before getting a permit to see if there are elevated levels of lead or arsenic on site. The applicant must either prove that there are not elevated levels or clean up the site before proceeding with their project. This requirement applies to all properties within the Boyle Heights Community Plan boundaries. Next slide. One of the primary goals of the Community Plan update is to make sure we are maintaining space for jobs and employment opportunities by maintaining the existing industrial land that borders Boyle Heights on the west and south, as shown in this map. Due to the input received over the years relating to environmental injustice and public health concerns, certain heavy industrial zones next to residential and other sensitive uses are proposed to change to light industrial, increasing compatibility between uses. This shows the existing industrial land on the map on the left and with the proposed industrial land on the map on the right. The heavy industrial shown in dark blue and the light industrial in lighter blue. The change from heavy industrial to light industrial means that new heavy industrial uses, such as metal plating facilities, heavy manufacturing, etc., would not be able to locate in these areas in light blue. Light industrial uses like food and beverage manufacturing, office space, distribution facilities, and light production uses could still open. Next slide. While the proposed plan maintains industrial land for jobs, city planning has received a wide range of input and feedback on the area closest to the LA River over the last several years. As part of the recently published Draft Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, a project alternative was studied that would allow for new housing and commercial uses in the industrial area next to the river by changing the land use to be a combination of hybrid industrial, shown here on the map on the right in purple, and community center shown in pink. The area shown on the slide and analyzed in the project alternative is the area generally bounded by the Los Angeles River, Clarence, 3rd Street, and 7th Street. Over the years and through focused outreach, we asked community members what they wanted to see in this area, and answers were mixed. Some residents wanted it to stay industrial, and others want to see housing built in this area. Because of the varied input we received, we included the land use mix alternative in the EIR, and it analyzed the environmental impacts if a different mix of land uses were introduced here, such as housing and commercial uses. As of now, the proposed community plan still proposes that this area stay designated for light industrial uses as seen on the map on the left. Next slide. This table compares what would be allowed to be developed under the proposed plan versus the land use mix alternative. Both the proposed plan and land use mix would allow for light industrial, office uses, and some commercial uses. The proposed plan would not allow new housing construction, while the land use mix alternative would allow for new housing to be built, including market rate housing, live-work units, and would include incentives for affordable housing. Throughout the adoption process, including at tonight's public hearing, city planning will continue seeking input from the community on what future uses people would like to see in this area of the plan. Next slide. As we've covered earlier in this presentation, housing has been one of the key topics we have heard from a wide variety of stakeholders throughout our engagement process. We have heard the need to create more affordable housing and housing that is affordable to residents of Boyle Heights, the need to maintain the existing housing throughout the residential neighborhoods, which is often rent stabilized or is more naturally occurring affordable housing. And we've heard the issues and concerns of residential displacement, overcrowding, and housing quality. Next slide. The Boyle Heights Community Plan has multiple strategies to address the various needs and concerns we have heard over the years. From a zoning perspective, there are two main objectives. A main objective is to safeguard the existing housing, often subject to the rent stabilization ordinance, within the lower density residential areas throughout the neighborhood, which you can see in yellow on the map on the left. To complement that approach, the plan allows for more housing and more incentives for affordable housing along the major corridors and in blocks closest to the L line stations, particularly Pico Aliso, Soto, and Indiana stations, the area shown on the map on the right. The plan directs a majority of new housing growth and development towards mixed-use corridors near existing and future bus and rail services, with the goal of alleviating development pressures on existing residential neighborhoods. Next slide. When we talk about safeguarding our residential neighborhoods, let's take a look at the type of development that is currently allowed. In most of our multi-family neighborhoods, the zoning today allows a developer to build larger buildings than what currently exists on most residential properties. This creates an incentive to demolish existing housing and replace it with larger, often more expensive units. To address this, the proposed zoning reduces a floor area ratio, or FAR, from what the existing regulations are in most of the residential areas. FAR regulates how many square feet of building can be built on a lot based on the size of the lot, which contributes to how large a building can be. Next slide. Most residential areas in Boyle Heights today are developed with multi-unit developments with 2 to 4 units and a building square footage that is much lower than the maximum of what is allowed per current zoning. Next slide. The proposed zoning right sizes the amount of FAR that is allowed to reduce the redevelopment pressure for these areas to make sure that the new developments are a similar size as the houses and apartments seen throughout Boyle Heights today. The new regulations would keep the same density regulations, meaning that the same number of units could be built, but at a more appropriate size and scale to the neighborhood. Next slide. As demonstrated in this diagram, the proposed zoning allows for development patterns that are more compatible with existing buildings in residential areas, while conserving the ability to build a similar amount of units on a given property. This is a key zoning tool in the plan strategy to safeguard existing households in Boyle Heights by minimizing displacement due to wholesale redevelopment of existing units. Next slide. Now let's take a look at another piece of the zoning regulations that are proposed for the lower scale residential neighborhoods in Boyle Heights to help reflect what is already there today. Many residential properties in Boyle Heights are developed with a primary structure and a smaller secondary structure located close to or up to the rear property line. Under existing zoning regulations, a 15-foot setback is required in most residential zones in Boyle Heights. This makes it challenging to update the structure or convert the structure into a residential use. Under the new draft zoning, the rear yard setback would be reduced to 3 feet, allowing for existing non-conforming structures to be more easily permitted or converted to residential units. This change is an important tool to encourage gentle infill throughout the neighborhoods, allowing for multi-generational households to have more space or allowing for additional rental income for a homeowner. This also allows for new units to be built on existing multi-unit properties without losing the existing units to redevelopment, encouraging property owners to retain units that are subject to the rent stabilization ordinance and maintaining the more naturally occurring affordable housing stock in the planned area. Next slide. Now that we've covered how we're reflecting existing development patterns to alleviate development pressures in the neighborhoods, let's talk about how we're incentivizing new affordable housing in Boyle Heights. The Boyle Heights Community Benefits Program is an optional affordable housing incentive program, giving additional development rights or development potential to applicants or developers that include a percentage of affordable housing units in a project. The program applies to all properties in the plan where multi-unit development is allowed, as shown on the map here. Next slide. The Transit-Oriented Communities Program, or TOC, began in 2017 after the passage of Measure JJJ by LA voters. The Boyle Heights Community Benefits Program will replace the TOC program within the Boyle Heights plan area boundary and tailors the incentives as well as eligibility requirements to Boyle Heights. This means that in areas with high concentrations of rent stabilized units and built out multi-unit housing, the incentives offered are reduced from what is allowed under the TOC guidelines. The proposed program also tailors the eligibility requirements to the needs of the community, requiring a greater percentage of affordable units than TOC does today in Boyle Heights, and by requiring larger unit sizes to be built to accommodate multi-generational households. Next slide. For an applicant or developer to utilize this optional Boyle Heights Affordable Housing Incentive Program, a project must dedicate a percentage of the total units in the building as affordable units, include at least 30% of all units in the new development with 2 or more bedrooms to accommodate varying household sizes and multi-generational households in Boyle Heights. And a project must be a project that includes at least 5 units in the project. This means that an applicant constructing a duplex or fourplex cannot utilize this program to get additional development rights like height or density. Next slide. What is AMI and what does it actually mean for these units to be affordable? The State Housing Department, or HCD, sets the rent limits each year based on the area median income, also called AMI, which is established based on countywide median income. The rent limits take into account household size and the income range. For example, this would mean that based on the 2022 AMI, a family of 4 with an income under $35,750 would be considered an extremely low income household, making 30% or less than the AMI, and would qualify for a unit with rents capped at $658 for a 3-bedroom unit. Throughout our outreach, we have heard from many residents and community organizations that housing needs to be affordable to residents of Boyle Heights. Based on that feedback, in our next draft, we are planning to include a new affordability category to the incentive program called Acutely Low, which would set income limits at 0 to 15% of the AMI, which would be $13,650 for a family of 4. Next slide. How many affordable units are actually required in this program? The Boyle Heights program requires that a developer or applicant set aside at least 11% of the total units in the building for extremely low households, which means that the household earns between 0 to 30% of the area median income, or 15% of total units for very low income households, or 25% of the total units for lower income households. The affordable units provided in these mixed income projects must be set aside and covenanted at least for a term of 99 years, which means that the property owner is required to keep these rents affordable to households at that income level for 99 years, even if tenants change. Next slide. Zoning regulations can help with building new affordable housing. The community benefits program we just described as an incentive zoning approach, which incentivizes developers to include affordable housing units in a development project. Another type of zoning called inclusionary zoning requires developers to provide affordable units in any housing project. There's currently an effort underway to look at a citywide inclusionary program so that inclusionary zoning could be applied across the city through one system. As part of the Boyle Heights Community Plan Update, we're working on an economic study to look at the feasibility of requiring inclusionary zoning within Boyle Heights, and we'll share the findings before we present to the City Planning Commission. Next slide. In addition to the proposed plans, policies, and zoning tools, the plan supports existing programs and regulations at the local and state level that protect households and residents, including expansion of no net loss programs and right of return. Existing local and state protections and housing regulations continue to apply, and any new regulations passed after this plan is adopted would apply as well. Because city planning does not have oversight on many tenants' rights and housing protection issues, we have worked alongside the housing department and community members to develop future programs to expand existing programs and fund new ones in the future. These can be found in Chapter 5 of the plan text. Next slide. That concludes our overview of the proposed plan. We have many pieces of additional information, including presentation and summaries from past outreach events. We also have our 4-part video series, informational handouts, an interactive zoning presentation and map, and the drafts of the plan text, land use map, zoning, and CPIO, all of which could be found on our project website. Next slide. The timeline here shows our current phase and what our next steps are. Tonight, we're holding the public hearing for the Boyle Heights Community Plan Update. After the public hearing, recommended plan will be brought to the City Planning Commission, likely in early 2023. Then we'll bring the City Planning Commission's recommendation to the City Council for adoption. We do not yet have dates for these future meetings, but if you are signed up to our interested parties list, you will receive an email when the date is scheduled. Leading up to and during the entire adoption process, there are many opportunities for continued public input, feedback, and comments. Our team is always available for questions or comments, not just tonight, but throughout the remainder of the adoption process. As you can see here, this process has been underway for many, many years, and we are very thankful for those of you that have continued to participate throughout the process. Next slide. We thank you all for being here tonight and for continuing to engage with the community plan process. It is now 4:52, and we will now be moving on to a brief Q&A session to clarify anything and take additional questions on the presentation we just provided. Please note that the public hearing portion of this meeting will begin at approximately 5 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernesto and Kieran. My name is Priya Mahenley. I'm also with LA City Planning. Kieran has joined us again. We did receive several Q&A, so we wanted just to take a short amount of time before we move over to the beginning of the public hearing to answer some of those questions. I do want to mention also, if we don't get to your question, to please contact us. We have our email noted here, also other contact information, phone, and if you want to write us, feel free to do so. And if we don't get to your question today, we'll be sure to get back to you. So give us a moment, just looking at the questions that have come in. Okay, so we did receive several questions about the proposed zoning as part of the community plan on the Sears site. So some questions just asking if the Sears building actually is housing unhoused population, and also a number of questions asking for clarification of what do we mean by community center. So I just want to note that while the draft community plan, it does propose a land use designation change for the former Sears site from regional center to community center, which means that the community center designation, which would continue to allow really the same type of uses that the current land use and zoning do today. And it would allow a wide range of uses. So that would be anything from housing, retail, restaurants, offices, community serving uses. And again, these are all what is currently allowed under the existing land use and zoning today. And just to clarify, any current or future development projects on the site or future developments on any site in Boyle Heights would have to go through their own permitting and approval process, and that is separate from the community plan update process and the reason why we're here today for the public hearing. So just to be clear, for whatever future project on the Sears site, that is separate from the community plan today. But hopefully that addresses just what we mean by the community center land use designation. And then another question, actually, was like two separate ones, but I'll paraphrase them and combine them. And Karen, if you can take this one.
Sure.
It's from several community members that have been involved in the community plan process for a number of years, and just they've been involved, and just curious why the process has taken so long, and also how we've incorporated community feedback over the years in our proposed zoning.
Yeah, that's a great question. For all of those, I think there are many on the call who have been involved for many years at this point. Thank you again for staying engaged for so long. We really could not go through this process without the valuable input we've gotten from all of you. You are all the experts in your communities. So we're very grateful that you've committed so much time to this process and helping us develop these policies and the zoning tools along the way. Over the years, there have been many different factors that have kind of affected the timeline. This iteration of the plan update started in 2012. The original version started in 2006, and then it was put on hold for a few years in 2009 because of the alignment of the L line, then at that time the Gold Line, extension to Boyle Heights. So then the plan update relaunched in 2012, and I kind of walked through some of the outreach we did throughout 2013 and 14, I think 13 focus groups, and several planning 101s. All of the information sessions and the focus groups, the materials have been bilingual. And we have summaries of all of these different outreach events on our website as well. There's a tab that's labeled events, and there's an accordion you can click and see all the past events that we've held over the past almost 10 years now. And then in 2017 and 2018, as I mentioned, we released a draft of the plan text and some initial draft zoning concepts. And then we really spent a lot of 2018 and 2019 working with community groups and working with the neighborhood council and some of the committees of the neighborhood council. We worked with a couple of the committees and had several months worth of roundtables where we were really going through and looking line by line at some of the policy language, and incorporated that feedback as well as feedback we received from other community groups in the draft that we released in the fall of 2020. This past summer, we just made some refinements to some of the policy language in the draft we released in July. We do have a summary document on our website as well that identifies what some of those primary changes were between the 2020 and 2022 draft documents. So hopefully that helps clarify some of it. And again, I know we've said it many times, but thank you to everyone who's been engaged during this whole process. I know it's been a long one, and we're really grateful that you're still here and still involved.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
Before we transition to the public hearing, I know there was a question about when the next meeting is taking place. So just to clarify, at 5 o'clock, we'll start our public hearing. You can provide your public testimony, or if you choose to submit a written comment, we will take written comments for an additional 2 weeks, November 10th by 5 p.m. And that input will be incorporated into a staff recommendation report, which we will prepare for our City Planning Commission. So that meeting and public hearing, we don't have a date yet, but if you would like to stay involved and be notified of future meetings, you can sign up on our website and we'll be sure to notify you that way. So that would be the next meeting. But actually the next meeting is 5 o'clock. And so we just wanted to break very shortly to now transition to our public hearing. I want to thank everyone who have attended for the info session. And thank you all for being here for the public hearing. Like Kieran said, just to echo the sentiment of really appreciating all of you taking the time to be involved in this process. We really couldn't have done it without you. So we'll break very shortly. We have 1 minute before we segue into the public hearing. Thank you all so much.